Hello and welcome to our viewers. I'm Tal Henrik here in New York, and joining me today is Harvard Law professor Mr. Alan Dershowitz, joining us from Miami today. Thank you for being with us.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be on. Thank you.
Thank you. So I know that you recently returned from Israel, where a heated, fierce public debate is currently taking place over revolution in the judiciary branch. It's a reform that has been put forward by the Netanyahu government. They're pushing for it. And at the very center of it lies legislation that aims to curb the authority of Israel's Supreme Court. It's called the Override Clause. Right now, the Israeli Supreme Court has the authority to overturn parliament decision. They want to change that. And I know that you've been quite vocal against this reform. You called it a terrible mistake. Can you tell us why?
There are several kinds of overrides. You can override political decisions, economic decisions, like whether or not there should be a gas deal with Lebanon or whether or not dairy should be able to serve. But when it comes to basic issues of equality, of due process, of free speech, those should not be able to be overridden. Those are fundamental rights. And 51 votes today in the Knesset, tomorrow the vote might be different, shouldn't be enough to overturn the most fundamental basic rights that a democracy has: due process, equality, and fairness.
So people, as yourself, who oppose the justice system reform, point to the fact that it might jeopardize the rights of the minorities, who will then be subject to the will of the majority in the absence of a constitution. Israel does not have a constitution. But, you have the counter argument, which states that for the very same reason that Israel does not have a constitution based on which Supreme Court justices in the country can provide their rulings, then they often tend to rule in a way that reflects their political agenda, take an interventionist and activist approach to cases that would have been otherwise left to a political discussion that could have been maybe resolved through a compromise. Is that so?
Well, I think there are compromises that are possible, and I suggested some compromises to my friend, Benjamin Netanyahu, when I met with him, and that is cutting the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court over political and economic issues, but maintaining its ability to have the last word on fundamental issues of equality and justice and due process. We have the same issue in the United States, of course. Here, the Supreme Court also rules in ways that sometimes overrule legislatures. And yes, we have a written constitution, but our written constitution is very vague. Terms like equal protection, due process, cruel and unusual punishment, words like that give the justices enormous power, as we can see in the cases involving Roe versus Wade, where they went one way in 1973 and then the other way this past year. So the difference between a country without a written constitution like Israel and Great Britain and one that has a written constitution like the United States or Canada is really a matter of degree. And what's going on really is that the extreme right is dissatisfied with Supreme Court decisions in Israel, just like the extreme left in the United States is dissatisfied with Supreme Court decisions. So they both want to change the results, and they were using institutional means to change the results. And that's a mistake.
But in Israel, I don't know as much as, as for the United States, but in Israel, it's not something that started now. This is a complaint that has been, raised for years, since 1995, the revolution, the constitutional revolution enacted by Judge Aharon Barak. You started to make this comparison between Israel and the United States. And one thing that this reform also wishes to change is the process by which Supreme Court judges are elected in Israel, which is very much different than the one that we have here in the U.S.
Right. And much better than the system we have here. The system we have here is very political. Remember, too, that the American judicial revolution is not new. It started with Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson thought the Supreme Court had too much power, and he didn't think the Supreme Court should have the ability to do all the things that it had the power to do. Every democratic country has a conflict between an elite court, and courts are not supposed to be reflective of the popular will. They're supposed to be checks on democracy, not part of democracy. And so those continue, and the method by which we pick I can't imagine anything worse than the American system, which has resulted in these ferocious debates in Congress. Merrick Garland being denied even a hearing as to whether he should be put on the Supreme Court. The American system is broken. The Israeli system works well. It's a balance. There are several members of the Knesset, several members of the bar, several justices of the Supreme Court, and the result has been a centrist Supreme Court, sometimes center left, sometimes center right, but it's never been a radical leftist Supreme Court. People like Meir Shamgar were conservatives. Many of the people who are the leading justices over time have been centrist conservatives, but particularly the extremists are dissatisfied. They want to have it their way, and they want to have it their way today. And the same way that many Democrats want to pack the United States Supreme Court today and limit its jurisdiction, both extreme sides want to have it their way, and the sufferers would be the American people and the Israeli people who have really benefited from a strong Supreme Court in both countries.
Well, it depends who you're asking. You know, as part of the judicial selection committee, the one that appoints, that nominates the Supreme Court justices in Israel, you have people from the judicial branch who have, well, Supreme Court judges who have veto powers over their colleagues. They can nominate them. They can. It's as if Elena Kagan could have vetoed the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh, or Justice Alito could have vetoed theoretically the nomination of Ketanji Brown Jackson. Isn't it absurd?
But instead, what we saw is the Republicans vetoing the nomination of Merrick Garland. Of course, under the Israeli judicial system, no judge can veto the nomination. You have to have 4 votes to veto the nomination, and they don't have 4 votes to veto the nomination. Look, I wish if I were writing the Constitution of the United States, I would have required a 2/3 vote of the Senate for confirmation. So we don't get extremists. We get bipartisan justices. And I think there are reforms possible in Israel. But right now, the right wing is not looking for reform. They're looking to basically weaken the Supreme Court considerably. It will make it much harder for people like me to defend Israel in international courts like the International Court of Justice. The Supreme Court has really been Israel's legal iron dome. It's prevented attacks that have been made imposing a double standard on Israel. And so I think in the end, it will hurt Israel to have a weakened Supreme Court.
But do you understand some of the claims of the proponents of this reform? You know, the joke on the Israeli right is that Israel is not a country with a Supreme Court, but rather a Supreme Court with a country. That's the joke. And late Justice Antonin Scalia used to say that he liked to read Israeli Supreme Court rulings because they made him feel better about his own court. Like, do you get the criticism?
Of course I do, and I've been part of the criticism. I think the Israeli Supreme Court has too much power over purely political and economic decisions, and I would have no objection to constraining that power. But when it comes to the most fundamental rights, I'll give you an example. One of the people on the right of the Israeli government wants to have different rules involving the ability to shoot rock throwers, depending on whether the rock thrower is an Arab or a Jew. Now, any decent court would strike that down as illegal. It's bringing Brown versus Board of Education into the battlefield, saying that distinctions based on race and ethnicity can determine, in this case, who lives and who dies. Issues like that should be left to the Supreme Court. On the other hand, as I mentioned, the issue of whether the gas deal with Lebanon is lawful or not, that's perfectly subject to an override. So I'm prepared to suggest compromises. When I met with Benjamin Netanyahu, I proposed some compromises, and he responded by using the term balance. Mm-hmm. He wants to achieve an appropriate balance between democracy and elitism. And that's a fair issue to raise. But I think the balance is fairly appropriate now. And I think that this series of reforms would strike the balance very much against human rights, civil liberties, and minority rights, which are essential to having a country like Israel, which is a democracy and a democracy that believes in liberty and equality.
Do you understand why does Netanyahu think that there is no balance currently, that the Supreme Court's authority is unlimited, in fact?
Well, he's wrong about that. It's not unlimited. It is limited, but it's not as limited as he would like it to be. And it's probably more unlimited than I would like it to be. And I think sitting down and having an appropriate discussion, not among extremists, but on people who care about the institution of the Supreme Court, would be a positive thing to do. Today, the issue has become very personal and very angry. And, we are a divided country in the United States, and Israel is a deeply divided country. We saw protests in the street. And I would have joined those protests. I believe in freedom of speech, and I believe in the right to protest. But I think it would be much better to sit down with rational people, people who care deeply about the Israeli judiciary, and strike an appropriate balance rather than just weaken the court.
Lastly, I want to ask you one more question, because you are in an interesting and a peculiar spot, rather, because on one hand, you object this reform, the judiciary system reform. On the other hand, you also, and people who usually oppose to that, they come from the political left in Israel, and they also wish to see Benjamin Netanyahu's trial ending with conviction, or they're certain that it will end with conviction. On the other hand, you also criticized these voices. You said that the trial, quote, raises grave dangers to democracy and the rule of law. How come you hold these two different positions, and why did you say that?
Because I'm a principled person rather than a partisan person. I have the same thing in the United States. I vote against Trump and I defend his right. So I'm constantly being perceived as being on different sides of the same issue. I'm not. It's always a principled argument. I agree that Netanyahu has been improperly charged and should be acquitted. In fact, I think the charges should be dropped. On the one hand, on the other hand, I disagree with my friend Bibi about the direction in which the judiciary should go. And I don't see any inconsistency or conflict between those positions, even though you're right. Most people who want to see judicial reform defeated want to see Bibi Netanyahu convicted and vice versa. And my views are more nuanced and more principled.
Well, thank you for sharing them with us today, Professor Dershowitz. We appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.